things were going to change. But I think VF was grabbing this idea that things are going to break.
Okay, welcome to Cyber Salon series on Internet Big Bang. Today we are delighted to host Ben Greenaway, one of the early pioneers of the Big Bang Internet, and someone who stayed with the industry on the cutting edge for a couple of decades now. So I'm Eva Pascoe, I'm hosting the series, and today we're going to talk about 1994 to 1998, more or less. So just really wonderful to welcome you. Great that you managed to find some time for us. And let's just chat about the early days. So the question, how did you actually fall into the internet?
Well, like a lot of people at the time, through college. Although I didn't really realize what it was, certainly not the first time. But the first thing I fell into was an email address, having an email address at university. I was a mathematics student, so the university mathematics department gave email addresses to everybody. I think most of the science department at the time were getting email addresses. This was, what I say, 94, let's say.
Right, so you were in Cambridge in mathematics.
Yeah, and I had this email address, and obviously I went down to the computer lab and used it once or twice, and maybe sent one or two emails to one or two other people who had email addresses. And I can't imagine I got much further than that at the time.
Do you remember the editor? Was it the editor? What did you use for email?
Yeah, well, it would have been fairly basic. Pico, possibly. It would have been on command line. You know, there was no UI. There was no.
I remember
There was a mouse on my computer.
I remember when we opened Cyberia, we only had the V editor for a couple of weeks, and I thought, like, this is not gonna hack it. So they will got Eudora. So Eudora was our first one. So your first experience was email, right? So you started communicating.
Yeah, and I think there were a number of pieces of like doing business around the department that went through email. So, you know, it was there, we got hold of it. But it was never described.
Did you have a computer at home? Did you have a computer at home?
No. I mean, Cambridge can be quite austere, to be honest with you. You get your room, you get a desk. You might now get an internet connection put in there, but at the time you certainly didn't. And there was very little expectation in the maths department that you would have a computer. Essays for other departments, they were starting to require that they were typed and handed in typed. But you know, there was no standard at the time for handing in math papers in computer format. So we were very much a analog, pieces of paper, pens and pencils kind of department at the time. So it was literally only when you're in the department that you would really use this system. And it felt much more like having a second porter's lodge, albeit an electronic one, where when you're in the department, you might pop into the lab, you might check your email to see what, if anything, had happened. And that was the extent of it. I think over that summer, as I transitioned from Cambridge University to Warwick University in the summer of 94 to 95.
Yes, so you landed right in the middle of the storm, right?
Human nature perfected in a kind of techno-shamanic community in a virtual cultural space beyond our present capacity to even conceive of and imagine.
Right, because that was the time where Sadie Plant and Nick Lamb were creating the virtual futures.
I had no idea what I was in for, literally.
So we were following her for probably a year before, because she wrote this book, Zeros and Ones, which was about cyberfeminism and the fact that actually, you know, majority of early computer programming and managing was done by women. So I was absolutely in awe of her because she was the leading cyberfeminist of the time. And then I trotted up to one of the events in 94. So we must have missed each other in the doorway somewhere.
I'm sure we did, and I mean I got to meet and work with Sadie a number of times in the following years, and really, you know, the transition to Warwick as a mathematician, you were moving from a very academic, rigorous not to slight the Warwick Math department, but a very high theoretic school for one at the time, and I think he still is there. Ian Stewart, the department head for mathematics, is a very practical mathematician. You know, lots and lots of outreach, tons and tons of computational power behind it. He was working on visualizations for nonlinear dynamics and chaos and fractals and all this super trendy stuff compared to Cambridge, and they had a lot of computing behind them. So I was expecting all the radical newness with moving to Warwick to come out of the mathematics department, and I couldn't have been more wrong, because over there on the other side of the campus, a lot closer to the bar, but completely different part of the campus, is the philosophy department and the literature department, and to an extent the business school, all coalescing around Sadie Plant, Nick Land,
yes, I think it was called
this new World Wide Web thing.
Yeah, I think it was called Cybernetic Center for Research, CCR.
It became known as that in a few years down the line. When I arrived, Sadie hadn't actually left Birmingham yet. She was still there. Nick was in the philosophy department, and it was a collection, a small group of undergraduates who had just started their MA as I arrived, and they were coming off of the first year's success for a conference called Virtual Futures.
So that was Mark Fisher, Henry Kunzru.
I don't think Mark Fisher was there at that time, but that would have been.
I'm sure they were associated with CCR over the years. I just don't know.
Yeah, there was a merger going on, I think, as I arrived, and some of the Warwick postgraduate team that were connected more to Nick Land and the continental philosophy school that he was running. As Birmingham was that team and Sadie's team were kind of merging with that throughout 1995 to 1996. I think 96 is the year that, you know, you can see C Crew in Warwick. It's a strange time.
They were very different, because I was just finishing my PhD in Barbrook College, which was affiliated to UCL, and it was in psychology, in user-computer interface. So I was very interested in the more kind of logical and ergonomic sides of computing and making computing easy for humans and generally easy for non-engineers.
I left Poland after Chernobyl, which was man-machine made disaster. So I was on a mission to save the world from bad interfaces. And internet and hypertext was one of the solutions that we investigated.
So we had a lot of that sort of pro-human thinking in Barbrook with Paul Barber, who was the leading edge of ergonomics, John Long. So I was incredibly lucky there, but it was all quite strictly led by industry. So my PhD was in the dynamic system and making displays better for nuclear power stations. So when we were watching this Warwick development, and they were more into reading Deleuze and Guattari and Lacanian European philosophy, and having quite an artistic trip of it all. And I was just intrigued how to bring it together, because I knew that, you know, our pro-human stand was good in terms of ergonomic design, but I also sensed that what was happening on the internet was much wider than just, you know, making your eye to go to the right dashboard, that it was going to be a bigger cosmic trip. And that psychedelia, that was coming up of work like, you know, Douglas Rushkoff, Cyberia, and the music at the time, that what I sensed that in Warwick, that they were bringing together the sort of more spiritual aspect of what digital media could bring. And I think Sadie was her sort of technoculture thinking was giving that bigger dimension. But tell us about the virtual futures, because I remember I was there, I think 94 in the autumn, which must have been just the first one.
Yeah, it would have been, yeah. Yeah, which was probably quite small compared to what was about to happen. It was a piece of history when I arrived, the very first Virtual Futures conference. And, you know, the engine for that, ironically enough, had been email, which was that the three students, or the three undergrads who had been working on that, two of which became quite good friends, Dan O'Hara and Otto Imken, they'd an interest in the collisions between certain pieces of contemporary American literature, so writers like Don DeLillo, Thomas Pynchon, and some of the European philosophy that was being worked on. Otto was in the PhD team for philosophy. And they were curious about some emerging collisions and some questions that were common to those two spaces. And I think if you wanted to grab one thing that made VF's interest in the internet distinguishable from other interests, I think this story along the lines of fracture and what happens during tremendous change was probably the line of flight they were taking more uniquely than others might. Everybody was saying things were going to change, but I think VF was grabbing this idea that things are going to break.
Now, this was all happening in the time when UK was in the deepest of doldrums, because the housing crash in 87, 1988 was very profound, and a lot of people were trapped in negative equity, but a lot of people were just trapped in unemployment. So the level of unemployment was very high. I remember there was no way of getting a bank loan on any activity. Forget startups, forget it. There was just no money for anything. I think the unemployment was running at about 8%, and there were no jobs for graduates whatsoever. So it was 5 years of really hard, down, bleak, black environment. And I was working as a programmer at that time in my day job because I was studying part-time. And I remember that, you know, unless you were working for Microsoft, you couldn't just get a job in tech because there was no other tech. It was just Microsoft or nothing. So it was all gloomy, restricted, and also politically extremely restricted, because John Major was in the government then.
Yeah, we just I think a lot of the UK had realised, or maybe could no longer unwaveringly question the conservative rule that had been running.
Exactly. So the Conservatives were coming out of Maggie Thatcher shocks. Remember, they criminalised raves.
Yes, I remember that one. That was fun.
I think politically that drove us as Cyberia Cafe then into politics, because we started supporting the ravers and supporting the festivals with ISDN connections, helping them to organize themselves online and fight that ban. So I fell into digital politics through that, because we only just opened Cyberia in September 94. So the ban, John Major banned in November, and by December we were already doing ISDNs in Kevin, Megatripolis, Bagley. To help out, banning music. And, you know, I came from Eastern Europe thinking that this is like democracy, and it was anything but. So I think that gave a very quick, you know, counterculture and contest aspect to all the techno cultures in that sort of 94, 98 period. But coming back to virtual futures, so you were engaged very early, right?
Well, as I said, when I arrived, you know, there were the stories of this strange hybrid conference that had run, that was internationalist, had people from the US and Europe and wide and far afield discussing the challenges in society, the changes that might be either technology-led or change in attitude-led, but, you know, focusing on fracture and synthesis of these kind of alternative possibilities, giving voice to these alternative possibilities. And what stood out to me was that the story behind how this was organized was just a couple of the students writing emails to people they wanted to hear speak and wanted to sort of, I want you to have a conversation with that person. I think that'd be great. We're interested in this. Can you come? So there was definitely a budget conversation about how do you organize an international conference? You know, how do you actually get these things going? How can you do it when you don't have a lot of access? So maybe
you used some of the early CuSeeMe, right? You used
Well, we did, but come for that second one. And as I said, by the time I'd arrived, and the success of that first one was quite striking. The story now is, well, we're going to do a second one. Okay, we're going to do a second one, but, you know, the last time we did one, we had a party on the Friday night or the Saturday night with DJs and some drum and bass music, which, you know, if you know where Warwick University is, it's right slap down the road from Coventry, and Coventry was one of the sort of focal centers for some really great drum and bass artists, some really good clubbing you could get done down that area. And those beats had been illegalized. I mean, you're right. It was a crime to listen to or to broadcast any music with repetitive beats, which sounds insane, but is part of the Criminal Justice Act of that year. So I think the other parts where you can't gather with more than 10 people on a street corner without written proof. There was a bit of a crackdown. It was quite strange. So that was, as I said, the flavor as VF number 2, 1995 is coming around, and that was May, I think, that we did that. But by then, of course, we've got various bits of technology. You know, the internet was being more World Wide Web. I could say that was you know, if you were bringing somebody new into what is this internet, you wouldn't show them email. You'd put the Netscape Navigator in front of them. You'd show them a web page.
Yeah, we started with Mosaic. Our first browser in Cyberia was Mosaic, and I think it stayed Mosaic for quite a long time.
Yeah,
because we were committed to, you know, open source and trying to do things in as open way as possible.
Well, the web as it was emerging became a topic of conversation for the VF conference. And, you know, on one hand, the web was a vehicle for what will these new communities look like? How might they intersect? Because, you know, very, very low barrier to entry to have a voice or to create a forum. So in that sense, it mirrored what had been the practical establishment of VF in 1994, just a few emails inviting a few people directly. Now we've got a nice looking email that's sitting on a screen and people can involve themselves in it much more. It became a subject of conversation. But yeah, equally, the number of academics who were interested in discussing this had gone through the roof, and the number of people who wanted to sit around and be audiences at an event like this had gone through the roof. So the second VF, as I said, I sort of volunteered my time to help out. I think there was something curious about having a Cambridge mathematician, as if we might actually be able to do something more sensible with the mathematics than some of the others.
And a musician, because you're obviously a musician as well. So you were bringing.
Yeah, exactly. So it was the excitement for me was having a philosophy department ask me mathematics questions, and having literary students asking me mathematics questions. So, you know, a couple of years before, we'd be looking at, you know, obscure pieces of pure mathematics like Riemann sphere projections and, you know, strange things that might happen on Mobius strips to do with whether surfaces are closed or open, which you just do. And then 2 years later, you're in a bar and there's a philosophy student or an English literature student saying, yeah, but how would that affect two societies interacting? You couldn't even frame those questions.
Yeah, this is a very good point, because what I was intrigued with Sadie Plant's writing, they have this concept of positive feedback, because obviously we were studying Norbert Wiener and the negative feedback in the systems theory and how they can apply to technocultures in a negative feedback. But she was talking about positive feedback. And I remember that kind of struck me as, well, this is what happens when you get philosophers looking at systems, but let's see what it means.
Well, no, and so the internet for them, then in that conversation, it's a vehicle for that kind of positive feedback. It's because it allows you to sort of superimpose two different lines of argument that might not otherwise meet, right? So it's that intersection of communities in one sense. I might see something that would only ever be in the mathematics department. As I said, before I left Cambridge, the only time I saw an internet, I'd have to actually go into the department, go down the wall, into a room, set aside with a very prescribed expectation of what I was going to use this technology for. Whereas in Warwick, there's this completely other sort of shape around it, saying, throw everybody at this technology and we'll work it out over the next few years, but it's going to happen here.
You mustn't diss Cambridge, because at least they had a Cambridge coffee machine. That I could watch over in Cyberia. We had that on our screens just for fun, because remember they had this coffee machine where somebody didn't want to be bothered to go 2 floors down to check if the coffee was actually ready. And that worked. And to me, that was as technoculture as, you know, Sadie.
You've gotten me wrong if I'm knocking Cambridge. There was nothing more brilliant than what that was able to do.
But you're right, at the point of Warwick, and the point that made the biggest impact over years and years of that crew was the total openness of multidisciplinary approach. Yes. Because I think that in Barbrook just emerging, but, you know, comparing to what Warwick was doing, we were straight.
But what I'd been doing, so between that first year and the second year, what I'd been doing online was more an investigation into how does any of this stuff work. You know, I think that a little bit of my grandfather mechanic was still in me at that point, and I actually wanted to see how some of this stuff worked. So I took, would have been the summer holiday between 95 and 96. So 95 to 96 would have been, yeah, in 95. And we're hunting around for a good, somebody show me how to set up my Mac online. You know, I want to be involved. If it's going to leave Janet, if it's not going to be part of the academics, and if it's not going to be part of the business sphere, how does it happen at home? How are we going to get hold of this stuff? And I couldn't find those texts. I was lucky enough to be in Boston, Massachusetts on a short vacation during the year, and found this great big thick tome, sort of the Bible of the Mac on your internet on your Mac, and also access to like the fastest modems. So a 56K broad modem for a Mac that I could buy in the States. Couldn't buy anything. You could maybe buy something about half that fast in the UK or Europe at the time, without knowing lots of specialist orders, I guess. But I came back for the next academic year, like ready and raring to go. I was like, okay, we've talked about this. You know, we've had lots of people tell us this is going to be amazing. What can we do with it, and how do we play with it? And that's why that next VF ended up broadcasting. We managed to sort of, I foolishly sat in the bar with the VF crew and said, well, if we think the internet's up to anything, then maybe we should try and broadcast on it next time. And I think Dan just pointed at me and says, well, that'll be your job then. So took that on and sort of moved from being theoretical to being practical. I think that was the first time.
Is it when you brought the progressive networks and real audio into the fore?
Yeah.
Must have been hard in UK to bring them.
Yeah, they were pretty quick on, you know, what do we need to move this thing on from just being a large encyclopedia. So how do we get to a more interactive, like in real time internet? And yeah, downloading files and downloading images or downloading audio files even was great, but there's no immediacy. There was no real time. You knew that there was, because we all knew of Cornell's CuSeeMe very early video conferencing servers. They were beasts to set up, and they weren't particularly easy to make work, but they did work. The number of people though on the receiving end.
We did a first wedding on CuSeeMe.
No, really?
It must have been about October '94. We had these two amazing people that were just not in the same place, but that didn't stop them from getting married with a priest who was yet in another place. So
we were also setting up Cyberia Japan almost entirely through CuSeeMe because we just couldn't travel.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That was
I remember I was in San Diego once in an elevator at a Comic Con, and I turned to the two people in me and I said, there was some strange internet news story that day, which is why we were talking about it. But I was chatting to them about, isn't it, you know, crazy how some of these communities are setting up, and they outed themselves as having gotten married in EverQuest, which I thought was fantastic. I'd never met anybody who'd done that before, but that's quite a thing. Yeah, so CuSeeMe, how do we do video conferencing online now? It's trivial. But in 95, there was really only that one solution. And to be a recipient on that was also quite difficult. There was no real easy way to just tune in to a CuSeeMe broadcast. It was a higher barrier to entry than we thought. But Real Networks, Progressive Audio, had a good audio transport solution. They were using it. I think most of the music sites were starting to use some of it, but very few of them had the live solution. And they made that sort of available. I think it would have been like February, March of that year. And we happened to spot it and say, hey, look, we would love to use that, you know, for the conference. But they said, you know, there are no transfer servers in the UK. We don't have any there yet. And we sort of negotiated with them to get us a pair of free ones. One of which ended up, we managed to persuade Demon, the internet provider in London, to host one of them for us. We
were very envious because at that time we were running with EASYNET internet provider, who was second after Demon, but the first one that was for non-engineers. And as soon as you got yours at Demon, we got ours on EASYNET. Because obviously we were working with the clubs in King's Cross, and it's like, you know, can we have a go?
And we did it for free, and we had no idea what we were doing with it. I don't think Progressive Networks had any real idea what we were doing with the thing either, because to our knowledge, the stream that we would then have out would be, we'd encode in there and send it, we'd forward it on. And they allowed us quite a lot of stream space. They really were undersubscribed for content provision at that time. And whilst there was a technical hurdle to encoding content and getting it in, once you were into, like, you know, a decent speed bandwidth connection on the back end, redistributing content was trivial because nobody had any. And we sent out not just the VF event that spring, but also Future Sonic conference up in Leeds later that summer, and a house, I'm not kidding you, but I think a house party.
Was that Drew Hemnet? Was that Future Everything crew?
Yeah, so that was Drew Hemnet, and as he would later be known, running Future Everything conferences. I think Future Sonic was an audio only one, but that would have been, yeah, out of the pleasure rooms of Leeds, a 2-day conference in music, and other really interesting digital music devices, from, you know, electronic violin.
That was very influential, because we then formed virtually probably a year later Cyber Salon in 1997, and got Cybersonica going, which was kind of an extension of Future Sonic, to explore all this sound online. And we ended up running Cybersonica for about 8 years. Based on those early experiments. And we were quite lucky because Cyberia was next to Whitfield Studio. It was one of the biggest studios in Europe. So every other day I had musicians visiting the cafe because they were recording next door. So one day Kylie Minogue came and decided that she wanted to learn how to do email. So we taught her how to use email. And she gave us a lovely interview, which I still have in my Cyberia magazine. I want to be a geek.
Oh, you'll have to show me that. I would genuinely love to see that.
That's amazing. And then you two, you know, Bono, they came, like 4 of them sitting around one computer, figuring out what to do with it, because the, you know, real audio and progressive networks were obviously noted, and people in the music industry was like, okay, this could be good for us. Let's explore. And I ended up with Mick Jagger being an investor in Cyberia because they got so interested. They just wanted to be very, very close part of it. And I think Mountain people, Barry Gordy, came to the cafe in, I think it was 96, because they were recording something next door. And they were on it. They were so on it. And obviously David Bowie, who we interviewed on BowieNet. Because he had his own internet provider, you know, he had the whole thing running straight very, very early on. And there's this amazing interview.
Those guys were
we did it. He was in New York, we were in London, and he was talking about, you know, I want to put the samples of my work online because I know that in the future, the artists will just provide their work and everybody else will be sampling from it. And that's how creation will work in a collaborative way. They were like, wow, he completely got it. I think musicians got it before anybody else. So that was quite interesting that there wasn't really any commerce around the internet. I mean, we wrote few things online to get SSL because SSL just started a secure socket layer. So we got something that people could pay for time on computers using online and putting credit cards into computers, which was quite scary at the beginning. But the musicians were forming this wave of culture around this. So the techno cultures were very much led by music, I think. And it's a good point you mentioned cyber, the drum and bass event clubbing environment definitely informed the explosion and also the fun of it, because before, if you had music, if you were a composer, if you were a creator, you couldn't do anything with it because radio was so unbelievably controlled. BBC was just, you know, a party machine. And Channel 4 was only in tiny startups. So you couldn't have any outlet for your creative work. So we worked on Cyber Salon with Richard Barbrook, who came from pirate radio. So they were so, you know, musicians were so desperate that they were basically breaking law by putting pirate radio on from the roofs in Hackney.
We're into some acid music, or should I say some junglist? Tune in 3 till 6 in the morning.
Sounds of the chilling 102.9.
Everybody makes a mistake.
Can't we?
As it makes it down, it's the Weekend Rush.
Rush FM is one of 5 pirate radio stations broadcasting from a 60s tower block council estate in Hackney.
Just to get something out. And suddenly, internet happened. It's like, wow, I can put my own stuff out. Oh my God. And it just exploded. The incredible creativity just exploded.
I certainly spent a few nights in Brixton Academy and a few other sort of like raves around London. And there was a time when you would expect, if you were at an event, that you probably hadn't seen enough. If all you'd seen was a band and the jugglers, they'd be like, yeah, but have you gone to the computer room, and did you get the goggles tried on, and did you lie down in that bit? And there was this sort of festival feeling like ringed around any particular live music event, where you could do anything from pick up a Greenpeace flyer, and invitations to the next band the bill march, but equally be sat in front of a PC with a bunch of very, very early VR goggles on it and be shown this is the future.
Drum and bass blasting, and then Shaman playing, and William Layton projections of genetic mutator on the screens behind. Yeah. And you can buy all sorts of pills while you were at it. So it was all connecting to US, to the kitchen bar via digital diaspora or hyperjam. So I think that was the reason why early internet was so diverse, because it was driven by musicians, and musicians by the nature of the culture are much more diverse than the technology people. So I was going to ask you, because I remember from Cyberia, we worked very closely with digital diaspora, Keith Piper, Derek Richards. I mean, we were lucky to host them on Afrofuturism recently. And they were connecting over ISDN and CuSeeMe with the American centers. And it was a lot of very diverse community around it, like our programmers, Cedric Edwards, and there was lots of people who came from that music/early tech. And it didn't occur to me that in any way that was not going to continue. But when the tech bros started pushing in, particularly Google, I think, has created this myth that you have to be white male to be able to do tech. And they started being pushed out. So how did it work with virtual futures? Because I remember you had Kodo, Eshon, and you had quite a lot of diverse community there as well.
I don't think there would have been a VF if there hadn't been a collision and a synthesis of very differing views. That was kind of what made it interesting. And we were certainly internationally well represented. The range of nations and the variety of artists, academics, writers, performers that I was seeing come through was vast and wide. It really was. But to kind of run back on something there, we were talking, there's almost like this moment in rave culture, I think, for want of a better description for it, that the technology was sort of sitting alongside the indoor festival. Only 2-3 years earlier, getting a sound card for a PC was nearly impossible. So the idea that the Sound Blaster 16 and like these early available sound cards were now the trending piece of technology. I really strongly remember that as part of it's happening around 94, 93, 94 as well. So conversations in the bar about which sound cards in your PC is interesting. The internet just allows you to do sound. There was a panel at VF that was focusing on what kind of performance art comes out of these technologies that wasn't there before. So there was a lot of new potential that was handed by technology.
The industry noticed musicians were around the space, and what can we do for the musicians to give them tools to create? So that was that fed.
Right. I think there's a good point to note here. And as I said, when I was looking, because I spent quite a bit of that year liaising between this highly active UK scene and desert in America.
Yeah,
it was stunning to me.
Yeah, they were about 5 years behind. I remember.
And it's the first time I've ever seen that way around. But each time I would go back to Real Audio and say, hey, you remember that really special deal you gave us just that once to have extra relay servers and bandwidth and blah, 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 that on paper was £20,000 to do a conference or £30,000 to do an evening, whatever crazy figure they were trying to apply to that, and no one was taking them up on it. Every time I was ringing them up, hoping to get the special deal, it was like, yeah, no one's using those servers, Ben. They're yours for the night if you need them. And that I found very, very hard to make sense of.
Yeah, I've noticed that because we were in New York in spring '94 before we did Cyberia. And I was based with a friend who was on the bulletin board called The Well. And also there was
I remember that.
Board called Echo New York. New York with Stacy Horn. So I was on Echo New York. That was not on full internet. It was just like internal bulletin board for the New Yorkers. And it was great fun. But I remember that we were in London. We already were doing stuff on early music and sharing games, sharing software. And they were like sharing talk. Even the most creative artists, they were just talking online. They didn't really have the multi-sensory experience. So there was a definitely bit of a disjunction, but then I think digital diaspora drove it because they pushed the kitchen and the New York bars with like, sort yourself out. We want to connect with somebody. And they brought then Timothy Leary and Allen Ginsberg. And I ended up living under Allen Ginsberg apartment in New York in, I think, 96 and sharing a lift with him. And it was hilarious. So that kind of early psychedelia was there, but the tech wasn't that. And also,
the only person that got high with Allen Ginsberg in New York without having had to get high.
Yeah, well, not go into that. We also founded something called Cyberia Records. So my co-founders in Cyberia, where they were a pretty lively bunch, and Keith Thier, who then went off to create the first pay-per-click product, Real Names in El Palo Alto, but initially he was interested in music. So Keith Thier and Nick Ryan, the composer who is now doing lots of work for BBC, they created the Cyberia Records to allow the artists to have commercial control over the distribution of work.
Well, yeah, so those kind of questions I think started to come, we're talking now in the transition years, I think 95, 96, we're now in 96 to 97, because the commercial conversation seems to come later.
Yeah, it was like 98 plus. Yeah, it was
right. Okay, then even later then, and that seems to tally with what I was seeing.
I mean, you were close to that because you introduced John Baines and the crew from the Lateral and Obsolete. You had the link between them, and they were one of the first companies that started kind of more commercial work online with the web sites for Levi, websites for a number of jean brands. But on the side, all of them were doing art, all of them were doing music, all of them.
Well, see, that's and I swear that's the aesthetic. If however much America did finally start to crack, well, where's the market for all this stuff?
And I think that made the difference. And then it sort of led through the Cybersonica Festival and Louis Sykes, who led it for a number of years. And then the guy who we met quite recently, so Alex McLean, who then took that spirit of open source music making and distribution to live coding and created live coding festivals, Algomech. We basically took that look, and that was the look. So
well, it's the bright yellow. It's the bright yellow and the neon greens.
The color palette, the psychedelia color palette, and that sort of juxtaposition of Fractopia with genetic mutator and animation, because we started putting these animations on projections, not so much on the internet yet because we didn't have the bandwidth to offer animation, but there was definitely movement in images and the kind of slightly baroque, overblown psychedelic look of the clubs at that time. And it was kind of interesting to see that it also had this sort of tinge of Blade Runner about it. So all the Cyberia cafes were quite kind of, post-industrial psychedelia. So we worked with this amazing architect Bernard Blauel, who was German. And he had this sort of very, very industrial look. Everything was metal and mesh and hard borders. And we were always putting some psychedelic images behind it just to soften it up a bit. So we managed to work with him on an amazing project in Centre Pompidou. They invited Cyberia to do the Cyberia above the ticketing platform, so right in the middle. And it was huge. It was like, I think, 30 computers, and they were hanging from the ceiling on black pipe, and everything was dark with sort of slightly bluish light, metal and steel, and definitely felt post-industrial. And Bernard led that look, but after that, a lot of things gone the same way.
We've created Cyberia Japan using that post-industrial look, but managed to add beautiful, opulent, psychedelic artworks on the walls. And the best place about it was the toilets. That was so great that everybody was partying there.
Because I think we had this sense that there was an end of something, but there was a beginning of something.
It had coincided with the arrival of an affordable PC that had sound capability and therefore lots and lots of music making tools, and a not so much a social movement as an events movement that was really looking for traction, looking for a way to get back into society. So yeah,
I think the concept of why it was so rich and so explosive and so incredibly fertile is that it was not coming out of nothing. It was coming out of Tory wrecked landscape of wrecked industrial north. And the ravers, I remember, lots and lots of interviews with them because we're trying to figure out how to actually help them. They were mostly kids of the generation that was unemployed in Newcastle, in Sheffield, in Doncaster. And they were brought up in nothing and no hope. And they were legging it to London, where there was no hope either, but at least we were together. So the passion for the new and the exploration and getting a voice was so palpable. People just wanted a voice that, we're not that downtrodden mass that, Tory government can just spit on and ban our music. We're going to come and get you. And I think that's what Tories were worried about, because we're kind of hinging on the revolution, and, it wasn't far from.
In 1994, John Major decided to ban raves. There was a lot of outcry and protests, and the popular protest was called Kill the Bill, where the ravers and the participants from the music movement decided to object against this very strange decision of conservative government.
I think a saving grace was that actually the kind American investors decided to check manage it, and people who had the passion and the knowledge and a little bit of skills were being offered jobs, paid. Like you could do what you love and actually.
I remember when those existed. Yeah.
This is my picture from Cyberia Cafe. We hosted underneath the cafe. There was Cyberia. Yeah. And we hosted a number of web companies. The greatest was probably Web Media by Ivan Kolb and Steve Barbrook, who then went off to be head of Radio Free in BBC. So they all had very illustrious careers, but they were producing some amazing stuff, and it went on the internet, and it was like your voice. You could be doing stuff. And all of these girls ended up having great careers. So Kathleen Cotter went to work in Channel 4. She became a Channel 4 community online leader. And everybody.
Sarah Breilinger, who was one of the Cyberia early collaborators and went off to become a painter.
And everybody was coming from Cyberia was actually getting paid to do what they like doing. So we were like, wow. Some of them went all the way to IBM to work on Watson, like Zoe Camper, who was one of our early cyber hosts. And she just learned all the tech in about a week. And it was just so amazing. So many women. I mean, I worked with a lot of women, and they all went off to have amazing careers. But then it's changed after we left the business, because there wasn't that ramp on which you can get on. When Google rolled out and imposed on people that you have to be like 21 and white male to be able to touch internet, women stopped having that entry point. And it was almost like a geological shift.
Well, are you saying this new emerging industry was recaptured by the patriarchy, Eva? I couldn't.
Well, it wasn't patriarchy.
Suddenly somebody noticed there was a business there, and all the powerful people said, let's have it back, please.
And I spent, years and years of trying to find another way of bringing women in, and I found it. That's why I ended up in fashion online, because that was another onboarding ramp for women, that they could get into it and develop the technical skills. And many of my apprentices who managed to sneak in that way. But honestly, these days you have to sneak in. A couple of decades later, music and the creativity still overweights all the crap that internet spits out, because there's so much good music coming out of it. We probably have to wrap up. So can I just ask a couple of final questions? So when you look at these early days, like what would be the big takeaways from Virtual Futures this first 3 years?
It has to be that although something may look like it's in one box, the only reason it's in that box is because you put the box there. And I think that's the truest thing of what was learned there, because yes, it looked very much like the internet was a tool for engineers and scientists and academics maybe, and certainly mathematicians and programmers. It was anything but, and it ended up being anything but. So that conference, and that philosophy school managed to break my box making apparatus thoroughly and completely. So I'm very grateful for them for doing that.
Yeah, it certainly made a huge impact on my life, because, I was sort of cyber feminist without knowing I am one, because, I came from Poland, where most of computing was done by women. Men were doing like hardware, and software was done by women, because everybody thought that that's women's work. So when I came to UK and realized that, this is a huge gender issue, I became very engaged in trying to address it, but I didn't have the name for it. And then Sadie popped out with cyber feminist. It's like, yep, that's up. And then we formed the Cyber Harlots to actually train. And I formed the first HTML course for women only, to try to get the barriers. Because, when we opened Cyberia, I really wanted to get women as soon as possible. But when we opened, we had a line 3 deep around the building, all blokes. I'm very privileged to be friends with Wendy Grossman, who is internet historian extraordinaire. And she always says that, internet party always moves on, and even Facebook will give in to Clubhouse or TikTok or the next generation. But the biggest thing is the open source, because you genuinely can create things out of nothing. I always have little projects going, like a bag with a light that goes on when it closes, or, little bit of like, techno weaving women stuff, because that's how you retain control over technology. Like we can whine about monopolies, and we can try to regulate them. And I know you are quite a proponent for regulation of social media starting now. So, we may disagree with that, but I know you believe in the sheriff time has arrived.
I think that
I might err more on the libertarian side. We can still do our own things. We can still set our own bulletin boards. We can still set up our own platforms. We just have to remember that we can.
You hit the point when you were saying, that the destiny of a particular technology is in the hands of those making it. And open source allows everybody still to be involved in the making of it. It wasn't just my grandfather. We went almost to schools just then, but my school experience, when I was 9, 10 years old, I think was my first real concrete computing experience at that time. And nobody in the school, bar one teacher, knew how a computer worked at all. And it just so happened that teacher was the teacher of my class. And this is not special classes. This is still young kids, where you get one teacher for the whole everything. They teach you maths, science, cooking, what have you. But he was an engineer that knew a bit about a computer. And so the one computer in that school was in our room, because why would it be anywhere else? Nobody else could. But he had no curriculum for it. No one was telling him what to teach anybody with it. And the first thing he did was, he put a little club together for those of us who were interested. And we ended up building a small little roving robot that would follow a marker on the floor.
Yeah, it's what we always say, that it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a techno village to raise an engineer.
I think also that it's worth drawing a difference that, with no curriculum and a device that you had to program before it did anything, it was just a black box until you started doing stuff, compared to the idea that computers in schools are good, therefore we will make sure everybody has a sealed glass, and metal brain that you can't write code to.
Breaks my heart when I see that, because you want
I find that challenging.
Open. You want cables sticking out of things. You want people to see what's inside. I was quite lucky because I was in the linguistics department in Warsaw, and we had quite a bit of AI, because at that time AI, Lisp and Prolog, they were part of linguistics attempt to simulate language. We got absolutely nowhere with it, but we did a lot of Lisp and Prolog. And then, one of my closest friends, his father was in a Polish Nuclear Institute. So we actually had Commodore 64. And, we were able to do a little basic of it. So I was incredibly lucky. But I do have a grandfather who was a mechanic as well. So that probably helped. And I'm just very conscious that, my children have wonderful grandparents, but none of them is a mechanic. So it's down to me.
Well, you'll do them proud, I'm sure, And if we get one piece of legislation, I'd like to push that, that we make sure the kind of technology in schools is the kind of technology you can genuinely tinker with. And we've got great history for that in the UK with the program.
Yeah, and you were doing fantastic work.
The ARM stuff.
You were doing fantastic work recently with DigiBlocks, working on the digital education piece to replace the computer driving license for Europe. So hopefully, good luck with that, and we will see that being rolled out wide and successfully. Well, thank you very much, Ben. It was absolute privilege, delight as always to talk to you. And I'm glad that we managed to shed a bit of light on the early internet Big Bang, the 94 to 97, and the crazy virtual futures period, which we all loved so much.
I'm happy to say that virtual futures have re-emerged after 20 years under the lead of a young curator, Luke Robert Mason, with his unique blend of sci-fi, biology, and cyborgs. And it has gathered a new generation of futurists around its events.
Well, thank you so much. And